The morning of June 19, 1944, off the coast of the Mariana Islands, Admiral Somu Toyota stood on the bridge of his flagship, surrounded by the hum of a navy that still believed in miracles. He was a man who understood the cold mathematics of war, yet he was bound by a culture that demanded the impossible. Above him, the sky was a brilliant, deceptive blue, soon to be streaked with the white vapor trails of the largest carrier battle in human history. Toyota had committed nearly every operational hull in the Imperial Japanese Navy to a single, desperate gamble known as Operation Ego. His objective was not merely to stop the American invasion of Saipan, but to lure the United States Fifth Fleet into a decisive battle that would mirror the legendary victory at Tsushima nearly 40 years prior. He believed that the superior range of Japanese aircraft and the indomitable spirit of his pilots could negate the growing weight of American steel. But as the first reports trickled in, the atmosphere on the bridge shifted from anticipation to a hollow, echoing dread. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The central irony of the morning was that while Toyota sought a duel of warriors, he was actually witnessing a collision of industrial systems. The Japanese pilots, many of whom had only a few dozen hours of flight time, were flying into a literal wall of proximity-fused shells and advanced radar-directed interceptions. Within the first few hours, the sky was filled with the falling debris of hundreds of Japanese planes, a slaughter so one-sided that the American sailors would famously nickname it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But the tragedy wasn't just in the loss of pilots. It was the realization that for every ton of Japanese aluminum falling into the Pacific, the horizon was thick with an American presence that seemed to defy the laws of scarcity. Toyota was looking at a fleet that did not just carry weapons. It was a floating industrial civilization. The question that began to haunt the Japanese Admiralty that morning was no longer, how do we win? But rather, how can any nation survive a war against a factory that never sleeps? This realization was the first crack in a psychological edifice that had been built over decades, a belief that spiritual purity could somehow overcome the crushing weight of 6,000 tons of steel landing on a beachhead every single day. To understand the profound shock felt by the Japanese Admiralty in 1944, one must first understand the ideological foundation upon which the Empire of Japan was built. Since the late 19th century, Japanese military doctrine had been obsessed with the concept of seishin, or spiritual power. This was not merely a morale booster, it was a formal strategic pillar. The Japanese high command believed that because Japan lacked the natural resources and industrial capacity of the West, her soldiers and sailors had to be forged into weapons of absolute will. This ideology was codified in the Field Service Code of 1941, which famously stated that one must never face the humiliation of being taken prisoner. The psychological narrative fed to both the public and the military was that the American people were soft, decadent, and incapable of enduring a long, bloody conflict. They believed that if Japan could strike a series of devastating blows, the United States would tire of the cost and sue for a negotiated peace that left Japan's conquests intact. This wasn't just propaganda, it was the baseline for their entire naval architecture. Japanese engineering during the 1930s reflected this quality over quantity mandate. Because they knew they could never outbuild the Americans in terms of sheer hulls, they focused on creating superweapons designed to win a war in its opening minutes. This led to the creation of the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, an oxygen-fueled marvel that could travel 22 miles at 48 knots, far outclassing anything in the American arsenal at the time. It also led to the Yamato-class battleships, mounting 18-inch guns that were intended to outrange and outgun any American vessel. By 1942, the Japanese Navy felt its technical edge, and its spiritual superiority made it invincible. Even as the tide turned at Midway and Guadalcanal, the Admiralty in Tokyo viewed these as temporary tactical setbacks caused by bad luck or local incompetence. They remained convinced that the decisive battle would eventually occur, and when it did, the superior Japanese warrior spirit would prevail over the materialist American forces. However, by the summer of 1944, the material reality began to exert a pressure that no amount of spiritual training could alleviate. The Japanese logistics system was beginning to collapse under the weight of American submarine warfare, which was strangling the home island's supply of oil, rubber, and iron ore. In the Japanese worldview, a soldier was expected to subsist on a bowl of rice and his devotion to the emperor. In reality, the garrison on Saipan was starving, and the planes on Toyota's carriers were running on low-grade fuel that clogged engines and reduced performance. The Admiralty had built a world where courage was a substitute for fuel, and where one miracle weapon was worth 1,000 cargo ships. As the American Fifth Fleet moved toward the Marianas, it brought with it the service force, a massive train of supply ships, tankers, and floating dry docks that allowed the Americans to stay at sea indefinitely. The Japanese were preparing for a samurai duel. The Americans were arriving with a mobile city, supported by a supply chain that stretched 6,000 miles back to the foundries of Pennsylvania and the oil fields of Texas. The tension between these two worlds reached its breaking point as the invasion of Saipan commenced in mid-June of 1944. For the Japanese commanders on the ground and at sea, the sight of the American Armada was not just a military threat, it was a cognitive dissonance. They had been told for years that the American industry was hampered by strikes, and that their ships were poorly built and manned by uninspired conscripts. Yet, here was a force of 15 fleet carriers and nearly 1,000 supporting vessels, moving with a terrifying, synchronized precision. The Japanese defense of the Marianas was supposed to be the internal defense line, a point beyond which no enemy could pass. The loss of these islands would put the Japanese home islands within range of the new B-29 Superfortress bombers. The stakes were absolute. The Japanese leadership had bet everything on the idea that the Americans would not have the stomach for the casualty rates required to take such a stronghold. They expected the Americans to hesitate. Instead, they watched as a relentless tide of steel began to flow from the sea onto the volcanic soil of Saipan, moving at a rate of 6,000 tons per day. Every day, without pause, without fatigue. The realization that began to settle over the Admiralty was one of mathematical despair. They were watching the arrival of more ammunition in a single afternoon than many Japanese regiments saw in a year. The foundation of belief was not just being challenged, it was being pulverized by the sheer volume of American logistics. The Japanese officers, trained in the art of the sword and the precision of the long-range torpedo, found themselves irrelevant in the face of a foe that viewed war as a problem of mass production. This was the moment the psychological shift occurred. It was the moment the high-ranking officers in Tokyo began to look at their charts and see not just lost territory, but an industrial gap that could never be closed. The invincible spirit was meeting the inexhaustible machine, and for the first time in the war, the men in the high command began to whisper the truth that they would never dare say to the public. The war was already lost, and it had been lost in the factories, not on the waves. To truly comprehend the weight of the despair that began to settle over the Japanese naval ministry in 1944, one must look past the grand maneuvers of fleets and into the specific, granular details of American logistical dominance. The Imperial Japanese Navy had designed its fleet for a short, sharp conflict where skill could outweigh mass. They had invested heavily in the training of their elite carrier pilots, men who often required 300 hours of flight time just to qualify for carrier operations. These men were the artisans of the air, capable of performing complex maneuvers that American pilots struggled to replicate early in the 1942 campaigns. However, by the summer of 1944, the Japanese training pipeline had effectively dried up due to fuel shortages. New Japanese pilots were being sent into the cockpit with fewer than 100 hours of total flight time, barely enough to take off and land, let alone engage in dogfights with veteran American units. On the American side, the transformation was staggering. While Japan struggled to produce a few hundred planes a month, the American arsenal of democracy was delivering thousands. But the disparity wasn't just in the number of airframes. It was in the invisible web of technology and logistics supporting them. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, every American carrier was equipped with advanced SK radar and combat information centers, or CICs. These centers allowed American controllers to see the Japanese strikes coming from over 100 miles away, vectoring interceptors with surgical precision. Furthermore, the Americans had perfected the proximity fuse, a miniaturized radar set inside an anti-aircraft shell that would detonate when it detected a nearby plane. This single technological leap made American 5-inch guns nearly 7 times more effective than their Japanese counterparts. A Japanese pilot could fly with the spirit of 1,000 ancestors, but he could not dodge a shell that didn't need to hit him to destroy him. The industrial gap was even more visible in the mundane world of fuel and food. By June of 1944, the United States Navy had commissioned the Service Squadron 10, a mobile logistics base that turned the remote Inuitak Atoll into one of the busiest ports in the world. This floating city included specialized ships that the Japanese High Command could scarcely imagine. Refrigerator ships carrying thousands of tons of fresh meat and vegetables, floating dry docks capable of lifting a 10,000-ton cruiser out of the water for hull repairs, and specialized ammunition ships that could transfer hundreds of tons of shells at sea. While Japanese sailors were often reduced to rations of dried fish and rice, and their ships were forced to burn unrefined, volatile crude oil directly from the Borneo wells, which fouled their boilers and created a constant risk of explosion, American sailors were eating ice cream and steak, supported by a supply chain that functioned with the efficiency of a modern assembly line. This was the material reality that the Japanese admirals were forced to confront. As the sun began to set on the evening of June 19, 1944, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese mobile fleet, received the final tallies of the day's aerial combat. He had launched 4 massive waves of aircraft, over 320 planes, believing that his longer reach would allow him to strike the American carriers while remaining out of their range. He waited for news of the destruction of the American fleet. Instead, the reports he received were a catalog of annihilation. Out of the hundreds of planes launched, only a handful returned. The Americans had not just defended their fleet. They had erased the Japanese naval air arm from existence in a single afternoon. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were gone, compared to a mere 29 American planes lost. This was the turkey shoot, and it was the moment the decisive battle doctrine died. The climax of this reality occurred not in the air, but on the beaches of Saipan. Admiral Keisuke Okada and other members of the peace faction in Tokyo began to receive filtered reports of the American landing operations. What they saw in the reconnaissance photographs was a nightmare of productivity. On June 16, 1944, American logistics teams landed 6,000 tons of supplies. By June 17, they were landing even more. The Japanese defenders, hidden in the caves of Mount Tapasho, watched in a state of shock as American LSTs, landing ship tanks, simply opened their bow doors and vomited forth an endless stream of Sherman tanks, trucks, and prefabricated bunkers. The Japanese had spent years fortifying these islands, believing that the terrain would be an insurmountable barrier. The Americans simply brought enough steel to rearrange the terrain itself. One captured Japanese officer, when asked what he thought of the American forces, famously gestured toward the horizon crowded with ships and remarked that the war was not being fought by men, but by machines. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological turning point for the Japanese Admiralty came with the realization that the Americans were not suffering from the war weariness that Japanese propaganda had promised. Instead, the Americans were becoming more efficient as the war progressed. Following the disaster at the Philippine Sea, a secret report was prepared for the Japanese Emperor and the High Command. It stated plainly that the loss of the Marianas meant the loss of the war. The absolute national defense zone had been punctured. But more importantly, the report noted that for every Japanese carrier sunk, the Americans were launching several new ones. Between 1943 and 1945, the United States would commission 24 Essex-class fleet carriers. Japan, in the same period, would struggle to complete only 6 of varying and often inferior designs. The evidence was no longer a matter of military theory. It was a matter of survival. The admirals saw that the American strategy was not based on spirit or honor, but on the logistics of overwhelming force.
Salvos arrived simultaneously. The effect would be instantaneous, overwhelming concentration of fire, with no warning pattern and no gaps for enemy reaction. The mathematics required were complex but achievable. Each gun's firing data had to account for range, propellant temperature, barrel wear, meteorological conditions, and projectile weight. Fire direction centers, established at battalion and sometimes regimental level, performed these calculations using firing tables, slide rules, and increasingly, standardized graphical firing tables printed on artillery plotting boards. A skilled fire direction officer could calculate time on target data for an entire battalion in under 3 minutes, faster if the target coordinates were provided in standardized military grid format. Communication was the critical enabler. Every American artillery battalion by late 1944 was equipped with SCR-610 radio sets for fire, direction nets, and SCR-284 sets for command communications. Forward observers carried SCR-610 handheld radios, weighing 35 pounds, with effective range of 15 kilometers under good conditions. This radio network meant that a single forward observer could call for fire from multiple battalions simultaneously, providing target coordinates that would be transmitted to each fire direction center, where separate calculations would be performed based on each battery's position. The American artillery system in Europe by January 1945 represented industrial organization applied to warfare. A typical American infantry division had 4 artillery battalions, 3 with 12 105mm howitzers each, and 1 with 12 155mm howitzers. An armoured division had 3 battalions, all 105mm. Corps artillery added additional battalions of 155mm guns and heavier weapons. In the 1st Army sector, where Richter's Panzer unit was operating, there were approximately 60 artillery battalions available for fire support. Coordination between these battalions was managed through fire direction centers linked by radio and telephone. When a forward observer called for time on target fire, his request went to the division fire direction center. If the target justified it, the request could be elevated to corps artillery, which could coordinate fire from multiple divisions. The entire system was designed to mass fires rapidly, shifting from one target to another with minimal delay, concentrating overwhelming firepower at decisive points. American artillery doctrine emphasized speed and volume. Gun crews trained to achieve firing rates of 3 to 4 rounds per minute for 100 to 5mm howitzers. Ammunition was abundant, with supply trucks bringing shells forward constantly. Where German artillery battalions might fire 50 to 100 rounds per gun per day to conserve ammunition, American battalions routinely fired 300 to 500 rounds per gun daily. The industrial capacity that produced this ammunition was staggering. By 1944, American factories were manufacturing over 2 million artillery shells monthly, more than Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined. Karl Richter sat motionless in his commander's position for perhaps 20 seconds after the bombardment ceased, his mind struggling to process what had occurred. His hands trembled slightly, though whether from adrenaline or shock he could not immediately determine. Through his periscope, he could see Lieutenant Weber's Panther, the tank that had been 40 meters to his left. The vehicle sat at an odd angle, its right track completely severed, smoke rising from multiple impact points on its turret and hull. The commander's cupola was open, but Richter could see no movement. He keyed his radio, trying to raise Weber. Static. He tried the other 2 tanks in his platoon. Nothing but static. And, on one frequency, a sound that might have been screaming before the transmission cut off. Richter's driver, Unteroffizier Hartmann, asked through the intercom whether they should withdraw. Richter did not answer immediately. He was trying to understand what he had just experienced, trying to fit it into his framework of artillery knowledge, and failing completely. There had been no ranging shots. This fact alone violated everything Richter knew about artillery procedure. Forward observers did not fire for effect without first adjusting rounds onto target. The process was standardized, taught at every artillery school, practiced in every combat unit. You fired an initial round, observed where it landed, made corrections, fired again, refined your data, then called for fire for effect. The process took time, gave warning, created patterns. What he had just experienced had no ranging phase. The first shells were already perfectly aimed. There had been no sequential arrival. German, Soviet, even British artillery fired in salvos with gaps between them. This was imposed by the mechanical reality of artillery. Gun crews loaded, aimed, fired, then repeated the process. Even the fastest crews needed 30 seconds between rounds. Batteries coordinated but not perfectly. You heard impacts spread across time, creating a rhythm. What Richter had experienced was simultaneity. Shells arriving from what his brain insisted had to be multiple batteries at different ranges, all detonating within the same 2 or 3 second window. The volume had been impossible to reconcile with standard artillery procedure. Richter had survived Soviet Katyusha rocket barrages that threw dozens of rockets at once, creating saturation fire patterns. But rockets were notoriously inaccurate, area weapons that sacrificed precision for volume. What he had just experienced was precision and volume combined. High explosive shells that detonated exactly where they were aimed, in quantities that suggested not one battery or even one battalion, but multiple battalions firing together. His radio crackled. Battalion command was demanding situation reports. Richter finally found his voice and reported 3 tanks destroyed or disabled, 1 operational. American artillery fire, unlike anything he had encountered. There was a pause, then the battalion commander's voice, tight with stress, reporting similar attacks across the entire regimental front. 17 panzers destroyed or damaged in the last 15 minutes. The advance was suspended. All units were to withdraw to positions with better cover and await further orders. Richter ordered Hartmann to reverse, turning the Panther around in the snow and retreating toward a wooded area 600 meters behind them. As they moved, he kept scanning for observation, aircraft or ground observers, expecting more fire. None came. The Americans apparently had shifted to other targets. This fact, that they could devastate his platoon and then simply move on to destroy another unit elsewhere, suggested resources beyond anything he had imagined. When they reached the tree line and Richter finally opened his cupola to assess the situation directly, he found himself looking back at the killing ground where his platoon had been shattered. The snow was churned black with earth and explosives residue. Impact craters overlapped, some still smoking. His 3 other Panthers sat silent, already beginning to look less like fighting vehicles and more like monuments to something that had changed. That evening, in a battalion command post established in a stone farmhouse 3 kilometers behind the front lines, Karl Richter attended a hastily convened meeting of surviving tank commanders. The mood was unlike anything he had experienced, even after costly defeats on the Eastern Front. Soviet artillery had killed plenty of German tankers, but those losses had been comprehensible within existing doctrines. What happened that morning defied existing frameworks. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The battalion commander, Major Ernst Klein, a veteran of France, Russia, and now the Western Front, opened with casualty figures. 41 panzers had advanced that morning across the regimental sector. 23 were destroyed or damaged beyond field repair. Crew casualties were still being compiled, but appeared to be over 60%. The Americans had achieved this in the first 15 minutes of contact, before German tanks had fired a single shot in return. Klein's voice was steady as he presented these numbers, but Richter noticed the Major's hands gripped the edge of the map table with enough force to whiten his knuckles. Klein explained what intelligence officers had pieced together from radio intercepts and prisoner interrogations over the previous months. The Americans called it time-on-target fire. Multiple artillery battalions calculated firing solutions, so shells arrived simultaneously. No ranging shots, no warning, no gaps between salvos. Just instantaneous, coordinated destruction falling from multiple directions at once. The technique required sophisticated fire direction centers, excellent radio communications, and abundant ammunition. The Americans possessed all 3 in quantities that made the technique operationally practical. A captain from 2nd Company asked whether there were countermeasures. Klein's response was blunt. Traditional artillery survival tactics, dispersion, movement, terrain masking, assumed you could identify incoming fire and react during gaps in the bombardment. Time on target eliminated those gaps. By the time you heard the shells, they were already detonating. Dispersion helped slightly, forcing Americans to choose between multiple smaller targets rather than one large concentration. But fundamentally, if American observers identified your position and called for time-on-target fire, you had perhaps 30 seconds from when they transmitted target coordinates to when shells arrived. Not enough time to relocate armored vehicles. Richter asked about counter-battery fire, suppressing American artillery by targeting their gun positions. Klein explained that American artillery operated with redundancy that made counter-battery efforts largely futile. If you knocked out one battery, 5 others could cover its fire missions. German artillery was rationed to 20 to 30 shells per gun per day due to ammunition shortages. American batteries fired hundreds of rounds daily without apparent constraint. Intelligence estimated the Americans in 1st Army Sector had 10 times more artillery tubes than German forces opposing them, and perhaps 20 times more ammunition available. The meeting continued for another hour, but Richter absorbed little of the tactical discussion that followed. His mind was processing the implications of what Klein had explained. The American artillery system was not simply more abundant than German artillery. It was qualitatively different, organized around principles of coordination and mass that treated artillery not as individual batteries supporting specific units, but as a unified, fungible resource that could be concentrated anywhere across the battlefield within minutes. The Eastern Front had taught German tankers that Soviet forces could achieve victory through mass, throwing enormous numbers of tanks, guns, and men at German positions until they broke through somewhere. But Soviet mass was often poorly coordinated, leaving gaps that skilled German units could exploit. American firepower was both massive and precisely coordinated, industrial capacity married to mathematical precision, quantity, and quality, combined in ways that left no obvious vulnerabilities to exploit. Karl Richter remained in command of his Panther for another 6 weeks. During that time, he experienced time-on-target fire 11 more times. He survived each bombardment through a combination of luck, terrain selection, and an increasingly fatalistic acceptance that survival was arbitrary. The skills he had developed over 3 years of war, the artillery sense he had cultivated so carefully, became almost useless. You could not predict time-on-target fire. You could not time your movements to exploit gaps that did not exist. You could only position your vehicle in the best available cover and hope that when American observers called for fire, they chose coordinates that fell somewhere other than directly on top of you. German tactical adaptation was limited. Battalion and regimental commanders emphasized the importance of concealment, of avoiding detection by American observation aircraft and forward observers. Tank units were ordered to advance only when weather grounded American spotter planes, to move through forested areas where trees would block observation, to minimize radio transmissions that American direction-finding equipment might intercept. These measures reduced casualties, but also reduced operational effectiveness. Armor that could not maneuver, that had to wait for fog or darkness or heavy forest cover, surrendered the mobility that was its primary advantage. Some units attempted to target American forward observers, assigning snipers and reconnaissance teams to identify and eliminate the men calling in the devastating fire. This achieved occasional success, but could not solve the fundamental problem. American artillery observation was redundant. If one forward observer was killed, another took his place. Observation aircraft flew continuously over forward areas. Artillery liaison officers accompanied every infantry company and tank platoon. The American observation network was so dense and so redundant that eliminating individual observers made no meaningful difference to the system's effectiveness. German artillery officers studied captured American fire direction equipment and procedures. They examined plotting boards taken from overrun American positions, interviewed prisoners who had served in fire direction centers, analyzed the radio procedures they intercepted. What they learned was technically comprehensible, but practically impossible to replicate. Time-on-target fire required radio networks that German forces no longer possessed. Allied air superiority meant German radio communications were constantly jammed or intercepted. The technique required abundant ammunition that German logistics could not provide. It required multiple artillery battalions available for massed fires when German artillery was increasingly parceled out in small packets for local defense. Most fundamentally, it required an organizational philosophy that treated artillery as a unified system rather than as individual batteries tied to specific maneuver units. The psychological cost was harder to quantify, but perhaps more significant than the material losses. German tank crews who had survived the Eastern Front, who had faced Soviet artillery barrages that lasted hours or even days, found American time-on-target fire more demoralizing, precisely because it was so swift and so unavoidable. Soviet artillery gave you something to endure, a test of courage and luck that played out over time. American time on target fire gave you nothing. One moment you were advancing, the next moment you were dead, or your neighboring tanks were burning, and there had been no transition, no opportunity to demonstrate courage or skill, no chance to affect the outcome through your own actions. Richter noticed the change in his crew's demeanor. Schmidt, his loader, became increasingly withdrawn, speaking only when necessary. Hartmann, the driver, developed a nervous habit of asking whether they should halt and take cover whenever they advanced across open ground. The hull gunner, a replacement named Fisher who had joined them after the original gunner was killed in the January 3rd attack, jumped at unexpected sounds. They were becoming defensive, reactive, waiting for the next bombardment they could not predict or prevent. The scale of American artillery operations in northwest Europe during the final months of the war was unprecedented in military history. By February 1945, American forces in the European theatre of operations had approximately 240 field artillery battalions operational, not counting anti-aircraft artillery units that could be employed in ground support roles. These battalions fired an average of over 10 million rounds per month, from January through May 1945. To put this in perspective, the entire German army on all fronts fired approximately 8 million artillery rounds during the same 5-month period. Time-on-target fire became a standard American tactic, employed not just for critical operations, but as routine fire support. First Army after-action reports from January through March 1945 document over 400 separate time-on-target missions, coordinating fire from anywhere between 3 to 13 battalions simultaneously. The largest recorded time-on-target mission during this period involved fire from 16 battalions, 192 guns firing together, delivering approximately 576 shells onto a target area of roughly 600 by 400 meters in a span of 18 seconds. The organizational structure supporting these missions represented a fundamental difference in how American and German forces approached artillery warfare. German artillery doctrine remained rooted in concepts of direct support, with artillery batteries assigned to specific infantry or panzer divisions, and primarily supporting those units. American doctrine by 1945 treated artillery as a general support asset, with all batteries in a core area available to fire in support of any unit that required fire support. This meant an American infantry battalion under heavy attack could, within minutes, have fire support from 12 to 20 artillery battalions, regardless of which division those battalions nominally supported. The fire direction centers coordinating these missions were staffed by officers and enlisted men trained at Fort Sill in procedures standardized across the entire American artillery branch. A fire direction officer from one division could walk into another division's fire direction center and immediately understand their plotting boards, communication procedures, and firing tables because everything was standardized. German artillery, by contrast, had variations in procedure between different divisions, sometimes even between different batteries within the same battalion, based on the preferences of individual commanders and the training different units had received. Communication infrastructure enabled the system's effectiveness. American forces laid thousands of miles of telephone wire, establishing redundant communication networks. When telephone lines were cut by artillery or armor, radio provided backup. The SCR 610 radios used by forward observers were supplemented by larger SCR 284 sets at battalion and regimental level, creating a communication hierarchy that could maintain coordination even when individual links were disrupted. German forces, chronically short of radio equipment and with their radio communications increasingly jammed by Allied electronic warfare units, could not maintain the level of coordination that time-on-target fire required. The ammunition logistics supporting American artillery operations were equally impressive. By early 1945, the U.S. Army had established supply depots throughout France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, each stocking hundreds of thousands of artillery shells. Truck convoys moved ammunition forward continuously, with priority given to artillery resupply. A typical American artillery battalion received 300 to 500 rounds per gun daily, sometimes more during intensive operations. German artillery battalions, by comparison, were often restricted to 30 to 50 rounds per gun daily, with some units rationed to as few as 10 rounds per gun when supplies were particularly tight. This disparity meant American artillery could be employed liberally. If American forward observers saw potential targets, they called for fire without concern about ammunition expenditure. German artillery officers had to make careful decisions about which targets justified expending scarce ammunition. Karl Richter's war ended on March 7, 1945, not with time-on-target fire, but with a mechanical failure. His Panther's transmission, worn beyond repair after months of continuous operations, seized during a withdrawal near Remagen. The crew abandoned the vehicle and retreated on foot. 2 days later, Richter was captured by American troops from the 9th Armored Division. He spent the final 2 months of the war in a prisoner compound near Nancy, France, where he had time to reflect on what he had witnessed and experienced. In interviews conducted by American intelligence officers in April 1945, Richter described his experiences with American artillery in detail. The interviewer's report, preserved in the National Archives, notes that Richter spoke with what the interviewer characterized as professional detachment regarding technical matters, combined with evident psychological impact when discussing the helplessness induced by American firepower. When asked what single factor had most affected German combat effectiveness in the final months of the war, Richter answered without hesitation: American artillery, coordination and abundance. The broader significance of time-on-target fire extended beyond its tactical effectiveness. It represented the application of industrial organizational principles to warfare in ways that gave the United States systematic advantages over opponents who lacked similar industrial capacity and organizational sophistication. Germany had developed impressive weapons: the Panther and Tiger tanks, the MG-42 machine gun, jet aircraft. But these represented engineering excellence applied to individual weapons systems. Time-on-target fire represented something different: mediocre weapons. The 105mm howitzer was not technologically superior to German equivalents, organized into a system that produced effects no individual weapon could achieve. The mathematics were straightforward and brutal. If one artillery battalion delivered fire on target, an enemy might survive through luck or protection. If 11 battalions delivered fire simultaneously, the density of explosives per square meter increased 11-fold, while the enemy's reaction time remained 0. The technique transformed artillery from a weapon of attrition into a weapon of annihilation, capable of destroying entire units in seconds rather than degrading them over hours. This systemic approach to warfare characterized American operations across all domains by 1945. In the air, it was not just that American bombers were individually capable, but that thousands of them operated in coordinated formations with fighter escort, electronic countermeasures, and systematic targeting. On the ground, it was not just that American tanks were reliable, but that they were supported by mechanics with spare parts, supplied with fuel by truck convoys operating on French roads repaired by engineer battalions, coordinated through radio networks operating on frequencies jammed to German communications. Every element reinforced every other element, creating a war machine that was greater than the sum of its parts. For German soldiers who had believed that courage, training, and tactical skill could compensate for material disadvantages, the realization that these qualities were insufficient against systematic industrial superiority was devastating. Richter had entered the war believing that well-trained, motivated soldiers in capable machines could defeat numerically superior but less skilled opponents. By March 1945, he knew this belief was false when the opponent possessed both numerical superiority and organizational sophistication. On the morning of January 3, 1945, when 90 seconds of time-on-target fire destroyed 3 of 4 tanks in his platoon, Karl Richter had experienced what hundreds of thousands of German soldiers experienced in the final year of the war. The moment when belief collided with mathematics, when training collided with resources, when courage collided with industrial capacity. The shells that arrived simultaneously from 11 different battalions did more than destroy tanks. They destroyed the illusion that will and skill alone could prevail in modern war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, Check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.